Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Down the years you may have seen me on the telly or heard me on the wireless, but this is different. This is the Brian Taylor podcast, brought to you by the Herald. Coming up.
This is the SNP desperately trying to look like it knows what it's doing in terms of infection control.
There's not much evidence that says that having stricter controls in Scotland actually is making much difference.
We have to be a little bit brave. We have to be quite bold in how we change the way in which people are dealt with by the police.
There's something about how we put resources in to divert people out of criminal activity, but for those who are repeat offenders, who are dangerous to society, how do they get dealt with in particular?
Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. Very warm welcome to my Herald podcast. On the show today, we'll take a really close look at the latest plans to counter coronavirus, this hideous plague that continues to blight us all. Should COVID passports be extended? That's the big issue. But first, the issue which prompted sharp exchanges between the First Minister and Douglas Ross at Holyrood, and that issue is the early release of prisoners. The controversy was prompted primarily by an absolutely appalling case, the rape and murder of 67-year-old Esther Brown in her Glasgow home. Jason Graham was jailed for at least 19 years for the crimes, but when he committed the offences, he was being monitored as a registered sex offender after his release from jail for raping a woman in 2013. So he was, if you like, out on licence. I'm joined by four MSPs and delighted to have them join me now. Audrey Nicoll for the SNP, Murdo, Fraser for the Conservatives, Labour, Sarah Boyack, and the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Alex Cole-Hamilton. Welcome all. Murdo, Fraser, let me come to you first on this business of the early release. Your colleague Douglas Ross, you're saying basically it proved that the system in Scotland was helping the offenders, the criminals, rather than the victims. He's going too far there, is he not?
No, he's not, Brian. I mean, the facts speak for themselves. This was an absolutely horrific case. This individual, Jason Graham, was a registered sex offender. He had 23 previous convictions, including one for rape. He was released early, supposedly under supervision, and committed this appalling rape and murder of a pensioner, Esther Brown. I think that in itself shows that there's something far wrong with the system when members of the public are at risk in that way. Now, the First Minister promised back in 2015 that the system of automatic early release would be brought to an end. It is still happening. In fact, even more worryingly, we've just seen published by the Scottish Government a new consultation paper which is talking about potentially extending it further to allow some prisoners to be allowed out after serving only one term.
It's allowing some prisoners. It's not automatic early release, and the early release of those who were serving more than 4 years. What automatic early release was ended in those circumstances, and Nicola Sturgeon pointed out your lot didn't vote for that.
Yeah, so this is about extending releasing prisoners potentially one third of their sentence, and I appreciate it's for slightly shorter term prisoners. But there's two issues here. There's an issue about public safety. So there's an issue about those who committed serious crimes who might be a risk to the public being released back into society. But there's another important issue, and that's about rehabilitation, because one of the purposes of prison should be to rehabilitate offenders. And all the evidence we have tells us is that the shorter the sentence, the harder it is to progress rehabilitation. And to have a system that is all about reducing the length of sentence and getting people out the door as quickly as possible means there is less opportunity to work with prisoners to rehabilitate them. And therefore, the recidivist rate, the rate of reoffending, is highest amongst those with the shortest sentencing. And that's why this is really worrying.
Let's bring in Alex Cole-Hamilton. What do you make of this the situation? Does this one case prove that the system is broken, or would you still defend release in some circumstances, or would you defend automatic early release perhaps?
Well, firstly, Brian, this case is utterly devastating.
Yeah.
It's deplorable, it's disgusting. But it is also, I think, very seductive to change legislation or change what we're planning to do based on one case, and we should always just take a breath before that happens. That said, I think this does suggest there is something fundamentally wrong in the way we do prison in this country. Liberals have been saying this for generations. We need penal reform. Let's start at brass tacks. We need to talk about what prison is actually there for. At the moment, unfortunately, it is for warehousing people who are by and large a risk to society. Just warehousing them. We don't do anything with them. And Murdo Fraser is right. I mean, he and I just...
Well, at least you keep them off the streets and you stop them tormenting people, don't you? And you stop them raping pensioners.
I mean, there is certainly a public good in that. But at the same time, if you're not doing anything else with them, they're freely mixing, they're learning from each other, and you get into the so-called universities of crime aspect of what happens when you just use the prison estate as a warehouse. Murdo Fraser and I disagree about a lot when it comes to criminal justice in this country, but he and I absolutely agree on the nature of short-term sentencing. The fact that if you're being sent to Barlinnie or to Sochton for 3 months, 6 months, it's of no value to you or to society whatsoever. You cannot have a meaningful intervention in somebody's life if you're only then going to release them, sometimes into the arms of a waiting police officer who has enough evidence to arrest you for another crime, just to put you back in through the system. Again, no rehabilitation, getting people skilled up and moved into other aspects of life.
Okay. Audrey Nicoll, the accusation is that your party, the SNP, the party that forms by far the major part of the Scottish government, that party is soft on crime and is soft on hardened criminals.
Well, before I answer that, Brian, I mean, I would just like to concur with the comments that Alex and Murdo have made about the circumstances of this case. It's truly tragic, and I, my heart goes out to everybody affected by that. But I disagree with this premise that we're soft on crime. For me, and I take on board the points that Murdo has said about the sort of two key issues around public safety and rehabilitation, where the justice system exists to make sure that those who are offending and in terms of the seriousness of their crime, they are punished accordingly. And I've spent 31 years as a police officer, and by and large, my view is that on the whole, when you think about the numbers who are processed through the courts, that works very well. I'm not actually quite sure what soft on crime means. But the situation that we're in at the moment in Scotland, and bearing in mind that this has been exacerbated by COVID, is that we've got prisons full of individuals who shouldn't be there. So I think overall, the courts take a proportionate approach to offending. And the reality is that we have to be a little bit brave. We have to be quite bold in how we change the way in which people are dealt with by the police and the courts, because at the moment it needs change, and that's actually something that we've been looking at within the Criminal Justice Committee. Okay,
I'm keen to bring in Sarah Boyack, but I'll bring in Sarah now. I see Alec and Murdo keen to come in as well. Sarah, what's the balance to be struck here? And there is a balance to be struck between protecting the public and perhaps the arguments of rehabilitation, between punishment, frankly punishing for the crime, and again trying to reduce reoffending. What's your take on the balance, Sarah?
Yeah, well, the thing that struck me from the First Minister's response was her comment that Scotland has the highest rate of people in prison in Western Europe. And that really struck me, because what we're talking about here is, should people be in prison, and should people be allowed out of prison when they've committed serious crimes, when they're repeat criminals, when they're a danger either to people they know or to wider society? So there's a massive issue about resources here, and the fundamental issue about how people get into prison. How do we divert people from prison? I'm just thinking about Edinburgh in the last couple of years through the pandemic. We've got young people that are assaulting buses and bus drivers. It's just kind of unknown to us. There's something about how we put resources in to divert people out of criminal activity, but for those who are repeat offenders, who are dangerous to society, how do they get dealt with in particular? And I think that case raises both of those issues, and there's a politics here of priority and how resources are used.
Murdo, then Alex. Murdo, you were keen to come in.
Sure, I just wanted to comment on something Audrey Nicoll said. Now, Audrey made actually a really good point when she mentioned the issue of COVID, because we have got an acute population issue in prison right now, which is caused by the large number of prisoners on remand awaiting trial because of court restrictions. We've got people who normally have been, backlog running, 6 months, a year, perhaps longer in some cases, as people are sitting on remand in prison, where they have to be because they are accused of very serious offences and they're on remand pending their trial coming up. Now, there's no easy, quick solution to that, but the one thing we shouldn't do in response to that, in my view, is start releasing people from prison who shouldn't be out of prison just because there's a crisis in terms of prison numbers.
Are you saying, Murdo, are you saying you could have other cases? I mean, this is a truly hideous case, the case of Esther Brown, but are you saying we could have others, maybe not as bad, but comparable?
No, what I'm saying is I think there is a danger, if you look at this purely from the point of view of numbers, of saying because the prison population is bursting at the seams, the way we reduce it is letting more people out inappropriately, and that would be entirely the wrong thing to do. Instead, if we have to look at temporary additional capacity in the prison system, perhaps by bringing in, I don't know, former army bases or whatever it might be, then or prison checks, I think we have to be prepared to do that because the alternative is a greater risk to public safety.
Alex Cole-Hamilton and then Audrey. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
No, I wanted to cover, I think, the issue of remand as well. And Sarah's quite right. I mean, for the First Minister to say, to wear the badge of the fact that we have the most incarcerated population in Western Europe as some kind of plaudit is wrong. I mean, that's nothing.
I don't think she was saying it was a plaudit. She was saying that was a problem. She was arguing that was a case for reviewing the system.
But I've also heard some of her contemporaries sort of use it as a bat to dispel the suggestion that the SNP are soft on crime.
Well, she was pointing out that we have the low crime rate as well. Perhaps that proves that prison works.
Well, it's not something we should be proud of. It's something we need to drive down. It is the catalyst for policies like early release because our prison estate is overcrowded. Murdo is quite right about the problem we have in terms of remand, and that's down to the fact the court service is woefully under-resourced. We have a real problem with legal aid in this country and cases backing up. It's led to a phenomenon where you have people who are accused of a crime who are falsely pleading guilty for that crime because they know they'll get less time in jail as a result of the sentence they get for pleading guilty than they would waiting for the case to come to trial on remand. That is absolutely perverse when it comes to a healthy justice system in our country.
Audrey, is it your experience that the public just want folk, you from a police background, is it your experience that the public just want folk putting the slam on and they don't really want to hear the arguments about rehabilitation? Maybe they just want, maybe society just wants a break from folk for a bit. Maybe there's let me put the devil's advocate case on the other side as well.
No, I don't believe that. I've never ever sort of sensed that from the public at all. What they do want is they want people to be accountable for whatever crime or offence they have committed. Now, I think most people who have been victims of crime have different feelings as they move forward from that experience, and but I really don't think that they have this sort of one size fits all. You need to get locked up, and that's it. I think there are some situations clearly where it is absolutely appropriate that a custodial sentence is what is issued by the court. But I think people are by and large sort of proportionate enough in the way they respond to being a victim of crime. And if I may, Brian, just come in on a point that Murdo made, and that relates to numbers in prison. And I think we're all agreed that the prison estate is bursting at the seams and something needs to be done. But I don't acknowledge the comments that Murdo made about it wasn't random release of prisoners, but just releasing them for the sake of getting numbers down. There is no way that would be remotely feasible. And rather, and I know from my own experience in my constituency in Aberdeen South as a member of the the local alcohol drug partnership, that there is hugely robust assessment of the suitability of prisoners when they are being brought forward for early release. And it just, it's far too risky just to say, well, we need to get our prison population down, so we'll just release a 10 tomorrow and 10 the next day.
Okay. Murdo, you were keen to come back in on that. You were name checked there.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I accept the general premise of what Audrey has just said, and she's absolutely right. But of course, Scottish ministers do have extraordinary powers at the moment, thanks to the Coronavirus Acts, to release prisoners in the event that there's a COVID outbreak in a prison. So, these could be used in extremis. So I think we just need to be aware that that power does exist.
Okay.
Can I just say?
Yeah, please, Alec, please. Yeah, Alec, maybe Alec and Sarah. Sarah, you haven't had much of a say on this one. Alec, then Sarah. Yeah, please.
Sorry to butt in. But no, I think that there's a really important subtext to what Murdo has just said about the powers of the Coronavirus Act. There is a suggestion right now in the corridors of power in the SNP government
that they should be extended.
Might choose to keep those powers in perpetuity, irrespective of the status of the pandemic or otherwise. It's not been widely reported, but it is, I think, a dangerous move for our democracy.
It's kicking around,
and as such, that's why Liberal Democrats, I know we're not alone in opposing it, but we will oppose it vociferously.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, what's your take on this? Where do you think we're heading on this? Are we heading down the line of further release under the consultation that's currently taking place?
I think we've got to have a look at our criminal justice system, because the points that have been made about wanting to keep people safe couldn't be more important now, given the experiences folk are going through. But there is also something about how the criminal justice system is absolutely creaking at the seams. The lawyers I've spoken to over the last few weeks, they are struggling. We had the issue last week in Parliament about the Edinburgh Bar. There are issues that need to be looked at in terms of how well the system is processing people who are accused of crime, and the lack of funding for legal aid. And there are some systemic issues that have got to be addressed that sit behind the appalling headlines that we've had in the last 24 hours.
Appalling scarcely describes it. Folks, I'm going to move on. Thank you very much for your contribution there. I think a very good discussion, a topic that we'll undoubtedly return to on this programme and elsewhere because of that consultation that's taking place. But let me move us on to COVID. I think you'll remember the COVID passports, or the certification that was brought in to prove vaccination. They were introduced for nightclubs, and now the First Minister is consulting with business as we speak on whether to extend those to pubs, cinemas, theatres and the like. Business is absolutely furious, generically furious. Gavin Stevenson from the Scottish Licensed Trade Association told MSPs in committee this morning that the impact of this, were it to happen, would be little short of devastating. It sounds as if it's going to happen, Audrey Nicoll, doesn't it? I mean, there's consultation, but there's talk about using either vaccination or proof of tests, etc. It sounds like it's consultation, but it sounds like it's happening from early next month. Is that your interpretation of what we're hearing?
Rather, my sense of what's going on here is more being driven by the sort of just kind of the sustained numbers of cases and obviously hospital admissions. I know Alex is shaking his head, but the fact is that cases are remaining stubbornly high, and COVID doesn't really bother about what we are putting in place to tackle it. And I'm pleased to see that the decisions ultimately made around the sort of extension or the changes of the vaccination scheme are being informed in time, and the decisions aren't just being made quickly and without a sort of basis on which they're made. So it is a really, really difficult job, and in particular, as we're coming towards the festive season, when many businesses who have been most impacted by COVID, namely hospitality and retail, potentially will, if depending on what the decision is, will continue to feel the impact of that. So I would rather see an informed decision taken at the point that they feel that's appropriate to make it, and it is. We just need to wait and see what that will be.
Alec, why the shake of the head?
I'm not shaking my head because I'm denying there's a surge in cases. I'm coming to you from my kitchen because I am isolating right now because a close family member has COVID. I'm shaking my head because we have had COVID ID cards, COVID passports in place for a month, and they have had no tangible impact on infection rates, whereas England, which don't have COVID ID cards, are seeing a sustained decrease in infection control. This is the SNP desperately trying to look like it knows what it's doing in terms of infection control. If ever there were proof that you were needed that there are better alternatives to vaccine passports, then it can be found at COP26. COP26 delegates were exempted from needing COVID ID cards. They presented a positive, they presented a negative lateral flow test every day or admission. That is superior to COVID ID cards in two ways. Firstly, it confirms your COVID status on any given day rather than your vaccine status. That's important because venues can then discern who is sick and who is well rather than who is vaccinated and who is not. Far more important in terms of infection control. And secondly, and I think perhaps most importantly, the lateral flow test just provides a snapshot of your health on any given day. It doesn't require anyone to do a deep dive into your medical records or to share part of your medical records with somebody who is not your clinician, and gets round that very...
And you're very unhappy about that particular aspect, aren't you?
I am. It is an assault on your right to medical privacy, Brian. And I think it is come against no discernible scientific backdrop or evidential base. The Scottish Human Rights Commission have expressed concern that evidential base does not exist. And we are seeing that in the fact that we are not seeing a downturn in viral transmission. Now, let me be clear. I am a massive vaccine evangelist. I think that vaccines are our way out of this pandemic. Everyone who can get one should get one. They don't stop you catching COVID, and they certainly don't stop you passing it on. So we can't guarantee that people going into venues with vaccine ID cards are well and that they're not passing on COVID.
Murdo, Fraser, what about those complaints from business? They're talking about it devastating, apocalyptic, the whole bit. On the committee this morning, John Mason, MSP, SNP member, said that to a certain extent he thought that business was crying wolf. What do you make of that?
Yes, he did say that, and he was shot down pretty quickly by the business representatives who were there in the room. The Scottish Licensed Trade Association and Gavin Stevenson, who you referenced earlier, Brian, actually did a survey of members. I think they surveyed 200 of their members who had been impacted by the vaccine passport scheme as it currently exists. And they reported a decline in trade of between 20 and 40% since it's been introduced, directly attributable to vaccine passports. Now, that's serious enough, but if you're talking about extending the scheme to other venues, that creates a whole range of additional problems. So if you take the example of a very small pub or cafe, well, the only way the scheme works is if you have somebody on the door checking people before they enter, and they would then have to employ additional staff. And in the current environment, even if they could afford that, they can't find anyone to do that job. There's another issue too for hospitality venues. We were talking about Panto season coming up, so loads of families like mine have booked tickets to the Panto already. Now, I'm vaccinated; it doesn't affect me. My children will be exempt, but there'll be people who are currently unvaccinated who've booked Panto tickets. There's no time to get vaccinated twice and get a certificate before Christmas. So if you booked your Panto tickets, you're going to demand a refund. So theatres are going to be complaining. If you're planning a Christmas works night out and you've already bought your tickets and you're not being vaccinated, then you're going to demand a refund. And all these issues...
You could say, the First Minister would say, them's the breaks. That's what happens when you have a global pandemic that is killing millions around the world. She also argued with regard to the licensed trade that perhaps people were staying away from pubs and restaurants because of the absence of the sort of controls that she's talking about bringing in, that it was happening anyway. What do you make of that one?
There's no evidence, and I agree with the point Alec made earlier, there is no evidence that vaccine passports are actually delivering on the two objectives that were set out for them. The first objective was they would prevent the spread of COVID. And yet, as we see, there was an article in The Lancet about this just the other day, making the point that there's no evidence that being vaccinated makes it less likely that you will spread COVID. And secondly, there's no evidence that the introduction of vaccine passports has encouraged the take-up of vaccines amongst vaccine hesitant groups.
Well, it's higher in Scotland than elsewhere in the UK, so that could be an argument that it is working.
Yeah, well, you look at the trajectory of figures, there's no evidence of that. In fact, there is contrary evidence, and if you look at what's been told to the COVID committee by social scientists like Professor Stephen Riker at St Andrews University, he's really concerned that the introduction of vaccine passports actually entrenches vaccine hesitancy. So groups that are already suspicious of vaccines are more likely to become resistant to getting vaccinated because if you
whatever. Yeah, okay. Sarah Boyack, you've been keen to get it, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Brian. Yes, I mean, I think there's still a need to focus on getting everybody vaccinated, not just quite a lot of us. It's got to be at the absolute maximum. I think test and trace, there's still an issue about making sure that follow-up is, because it can take days for people to get contacted, by which point if they have been impacted, they could have infected quite a lot of people. And I suppose the other thing is, we've been saying all along is, and particularly in the context of vaccine passports, lateral flow tests, actually testing whether people have got the virus is absolutely critical. Are people carrying that virus around? And in terms of how vaccine passports work, I actually asked the First Minister about real life experience of constituents who've been in other parts of the UK, have been vaccinated, but it does not show on the Scottish vaccine passport. The complexity of it. Yeah. The First Minister couldn't actually give me a straight answer in the chamber. People from England, in England who've been vaccinated, and I had a constituent who actually had been vaccinated in Northern Ireland, was told she'd have to go down the foreign route. Now that was from the actual NHS helpline. So there's something about the knowledge here that's been passed on that's inaccurate to people.
Pick you up on the lateral flow test. Let's talk about that. I mean, the suggestion now is that it could be vaccination. The option would be to have lateral flow tests, or even that you have to have both to get a degree of registration. What do you make about that, Sarah Boyack? Would extending it to other venues, and perhaps extending the scope of the requirement, would that work, or is that adding to the complexity that you're talking about there, Sarah?
I think there's something about how we as individuals actually act. So there's something about wearing a mask in a crowded space if you don't have the underlying health issue that makes it difficult for you. There's something about it routinely. If you have to go into work, routinely taking that lateral flow test. And if you are going out and about, it's partly to protect yourself in terms of wearing a mask, but it's also to protect your friends and your family from being infected, because, you know, it's out there. All of us will now have friends and family who've really been badly impacted. And that's on a good day. There are people who've lost their lives. There's something about winning people over, bringing them with us, and just making people think about the reality for them if you are not taking part of that process.
So to be clear, are you in favour of the vaccine passports, to use the shorthand, or not? Do you believe they're effective or not?
Oh, well, we have been criticising them for weeks about their lack of effectiveness, about how hospitality, for example, are meant to operate them. And just the last example I gave you, people not able to have a vaccine passport, even though they've been vaccinated. The system is clearly not working. That's why we've been going for test and trace and lateral flow tests, much more pragmatic and much more direct in terms of limiting people transferring the disease to each other.
Audrey Nicoll, it doesn't work. It's too much of a guddle.
Well, I think it's in the grand scheme of things, it's relatively early days, and I'm not for 1 minute saying that the system is perfect. It would be extremely naive of me to do that. But I want to pick up on Sarah's points. I think she's absolutely spot on in terms of the comments that she's made about how we behave in many ways. So we acknowledge that there are challenges with the passport scheme. It is one of many options in the toolbox, if you like. But I think more importantly, it comes back to what Sarah's alluded to, is about our own behaviour. It's about making sure we get our vaccines. It's about social distancing. It's about wearing our masks, cleaning our hands. It's just such basic stuff. And, you know, going back to the point that Murdo made about evidence, that's absolutely right. But I don't know if it would be there's sometimes, although you can say, well, there is no evidence of something, you can also say that, well, there is no evidence that it hasn't. There hasn't been some.
Could have been worse. Yeah.
Some bearing. We just don't
that's
know
not right.
Alec Cole-Hamilton. Alec.
Yeah, I mentioned COP26 earlier, Brian, and we know that the delegates were not required to have a vaccine passport and were not asked for one. They were asked for a negative LFT. And we know from statistically speaking, the First Minister said herself that they had created the safest environment possible, that you were 3 times less likely to get COVID, to test positive for COVID if you were a delegate at that event than anyone else in the general population.
Yeah, but you can't replicate that across Scotland on a daily basis, can you? You can't do that. You can't replicate that.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, the government quoted that as a justification for how safe the event was. They said it's the safest possible environment. Well, if they recognise that as the safest possible environment, they need to build a system around LFT testing, which is far less intrusive in terms of accessing your medical data, sharing it with somebody who is not your clinician, than a vaccine passport is. Evidence of past treatment is a very slippery slope to go down. I think we have all the evidence we need, Brian, and a halfway house, some suggestion that you could have either or, will actually remove entirely the first reason that the First Minister introduced that, which is to drive up vaccine uptake. Because if people who are vaccine hesitant have an option to produce an LFT instead, then what's the incentive for them to go and get vaccinated?
The First Minister argued that in the early days the drive was to get vaccination up, but then perhaps you've achieved that to some extent, and Scotland does have the highest rate in the UK. So now you can move on to the other element.
Well, let's abandon the vaccine passports then. If we've achieved the goal, if we've achieved the summit of our expectations around the vaccines, then let's dispense with them, because they're not keeping people safe. As I said at the start, LFTs give a snapshot of your COVID status on the day, not your vaccine status, and that allows venues to discern who is sick and who is well and keep people safe on that basis. Just knowing that everybody around you is vaccinated doesn't mean they don't have COVID.
Doesn't make a hoop. Murdo, Fraser, you were keen to come in, and then Sarah. Murdo, then Sarah. Murdo first.
Yeah, two things briefly. First of all, on lateral flow tests, I think bringing in lateral flow tests alongside vaccine passports as an alternative would be an improvement, because it would remove, at the very least, the human rights aspect of people objecting to having to provide vaccine certification. But it's not perfect, because it would still present the problems for business that they still have to have people on the door checking entry, and that would still be a burden. So it would be better, but it's not a perfect solution. Audrey made the point about evidence. I think there's a risk in all of this, right? That people adopt the "something must be done" approach, right? Yeah. So we have a problem with COVID. Something must be done. We don't know whether it works or not, but we must try something. What I find really difficult to understand in all this, and this is an issue which, on the COVID recovery committee, we ask our scientific advisors, why is it that in Scotland we are much more restrictive than happens south of the border. So we have to have compulsory wearing a face mask, we have vaccine passports. They don't have these in England. And yet the case rates in England right now are pretty much identical on a population share compared to what we have in Scotland. So there's not much evidence that says that having stricter controls in Scotland actually is making much difference. So it's actually really difficult to understand what are the right things to do.
Thanks, Murdo. First, Sarah Boyack, you were keen to come in. Sarah.
Thanks, Brian. I just wanted to come back to the vaccine issue. It's partly about getting everyone to get the vaccine and to follow the advice of the scientists about what age and to enable young people to have that access. But it's also about the boosters, the booster vaccine, because there's something about making sure that you're still safe, because if you have had your 2 jabs and then you get your booster jab, you're less likely to be seriously ill. And that is a bonus for our NHS. It's a bonus for the individual. So rolling out the vaccine is not something we can take our feet off the accelerator on. And I suppose the issue is, as MSPs, we get people who have problems, but I am still getting constituents who cannot get access to their boosters. I had somebody last week who was aged, very vulnerable. A week later, they had actually got the information, but trying to rearrange where you're getting your vaccine, if you're given somewhere that is miles away, you're a older person without a car, there are some real practical issues here about making it as accessible as possible. So even the boosters have to be treated as seriously as the initial rollout, and that's about resource and it's about making it practical for people. And I just think we are going to be here for some time to keep people safe. I mean, I'm a bit of a nerd. I look at the stats every day, and I'm genuinely shocked that Edinburgh's rates are going up, whereas Glasgow's rates, which we all thought would go up after COP26, are actually relatively stable. So there's something about local information, local access to vaccines, and local access to flu boosters. It's actually all of that preventative health stuff and our lifestyles. And when you meet people from Southeast Asia who wear masks, which we used to think was rather odd, I've talked to people during COP, they had the experience of SARS. So there's something about learning from dangerous outbreaks in the past and informing our whole public health approach going forward.
You see Asian students in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and they were routinely wearing masks long before we heard of COVID-19. Nicoll Hamilton, the First Minister, wasn't saying that the system of, again, to use the shorthand, COVID passports was ideal, but she was saying it was a weapon in the armoury against COVID. And she was pointing out that around Europe, Germany is declaring a fourth wave crisis. Austria is having to virtually, put a curfew upon people who don't have the vaccines. This is still a huge challenge. And perhaps this is one of the weapons in the armoury, to use the phrase. Alec, what do you make?
It is a huge challenge, of course, and I'm not in any way denying that. But I point, Brian, to an event that took place in Cornwall in the summer. It was called Boardmasters, a big surfing event. That was by its own choice. It was a vaccine passported event. Everyone who was attending had to present evidence that they'd had both shots. 5,000 people still caught COVID at that event. And that just goes to show that whilst it may be all well and good to know that everyone around you is vaccinated, it doesn't keep you safe from the virus. In fact, there is a suggestion that actually it lulls people into a false sense of security. They're in a stadium or in a venue where they know everyone else is vaccinated. Maybe perhaps people dispense with social distancing. Maybe they lose the face mask. But it does give you a false sense that you have a protection that doesn't exist. Vaccines protect you from harm. They do not protect you from transmission.
How about that, Audrey Nicoll? A false sense of security, perhaps. That's a potential source of concern, isn't it?
I take the point that Alex is making, and it's not new, but I think it's one that we have to be mindful of. I think there will be, especially perhaps younger people who are a wee bit more. I've got a 19-year-old son, and he took quite a lot of persuading to get his vaccine in the first place.
Why was that? Why? Let me pick you up. What was the reason? What was his objection to getting the vaccine?
I don't think he objected to getting the vaccine. I think he's just a fit and healthy young guy, and getting vaccines isn't much of a priority for him.
No.
What did matter was the fact that he needed to get it in respect of his employment.
Okay.
But I think it's a very reasonable point to make, and it's one that we need to be mindful of. And I think Sarah's point about the importance of getting our boosters is really important as well. I heard Professor Sridhar on the news the other day talking about current research that shows that 2 vaccines plus your booster gives you a really high level of protection. So encouraging people to get their booster over and above their vaccine. So I think that there are lots of dynamics here, and I think strong messages encouraging people to get that primary protection is really, really fundamental, because we're all agreed that COVID is not going away, and we are going to have to make some adaptations in our lives to live with it and not leave it behind.
I'm going to ask about that in a minute, but Murdo, Fraser, you were keen to come in on the current debate, please.
Yeah, just to agree with what Audrey said about the importance of boosters, and that's a very significant issue. But we do have an issue, and this was raised at First Minister's Questions today by my colleague Brian Whittle, because people going on now to try and book booster appointments are in some cases finding it's mid-late January before they can get an appointment. And there's another dimension to this, because what NHS Scotland has done for the over 50 age group, which some of us might be in, Brian, is that they're tied the booster to the flu vaccine. Now, if that means you're not getting your flu jab until late January, in actual fact, the peak season for flu may well have passed by the time you're getting your flu jab. I think that is a big concern, because people could actually be at risk because they're not getting their flu jab until later than they should otherwise have it.
Thanks, Murdo. Let me move you on. Murdo, you mentioned there, I'm going to move on to a final topic related to COVID. And I think Audrey Nicoll mentioned it, the idea that we have to live with it to some extent. Now, the First Minister was very reluctant to use that phrase in earlier days. It sounded a bit like, almost surrendering to the virus. And I understand why she was concerned and reluctant to use it. But she's now saying if we have to live with it to some extent, we have to get used to the consequences of it. Let's start with Sarah Boyack. Sarah, what is, you said you study the stats every day, and the stats are still pretty challenging to say the least. Is there an exit route? Is there an end game for COVID, or do we just simply have to get used to it, perhaps living with it at a diminished level?
Well, talking to people from Southeast Asia at COP, it was a kind of in the sidelines of talking about climate change, talked to people from Taiwan, Bangladesh. And one of the things that we South Africa as well, one of the things we talked about was the distribution of vaccines across the world. Yeah. Because until everyone is safe, we are not safe. And we've had different variants of vaccines, the Delta variant, which is absolutely horrific. The UK made a promise, other well-developed countries made a promise of access to vaccines for low-income countries into the global south. That has just not been fulfilled at all. Now, I put a members' motion down, and it got about 50% of Parliament signed up to the principle. And the last time I checked, it was just over 10% of the vaccines that had been promised were distributed. Now, one of the things the UK did, which, actually give credit, there was the Oxford University AstraZeneca link-up, which was using public sector investment, working with a university to actually create a vaccine that was going to work. There's something about enabling the intellectual property rights of how vaccines are produced to be able to be spread to those developing countries who've got health services that make our health service look happy. Now, we know our health service is on the brink. Yeah. It's impossible to imagine some of those countries where people are dying at a level we cannot even imagine. So there's a fairness issue, but there's also a self-interested issue for us, I think. We live in a global world. I am probably not alone being desperate to go abroad on holiday. I feel very lucky. I've been to Broughty Ferry, I've been to Glasgow, I went to London and Brighton. That doesn't cut it for me. I'm very lucky I can afford to go abroad. But seriously, we can't go back to that kind of lifestyle, whether it's a train or a plane we go to travel abroad. How do we do that when we've got a vaccine that is still a virus that is still rampaging around the world and is potentially developing? So there's something about a global justice aspect here that I think we should be stepping up to the mark on. And I'm disappointed not to have seen action on it thus far.
Very good point. I mean, for goodness sake, you've been to the ferry and you're still keen to go on foreign trips. I don't know, dear.
I will go back to the ferry. I loved it.
Wonderful place, glorious little putting green and fabulous ice cream and one or two little pubs that I'm told people visit them occasionally. Not me. But Murdo, Fraser, is there an exit route? Is there an end game, or do we just have to get used to it again, perhaps at a diminished level?
I think we're just going to have to learn to live with this. And I'm sorry to say, I think that the booster program is just the start of it. I suspect we'll all be getting annual jabs just to see off COVID. It will probably continue to come in waves, in different forms. It's continually mutating as a virus, so we'll see different variants coming, and we'll have to learn to live with it. And it just means, I think, things like hand washing, face mask wearing in certain circumstances probably is with us for the long term, and that's not a great prospect. I think that's where we are.
one scientist suggested to me that the way these things sometimes happen is they mutate into a form that no longer makes us ill. It spreads but no longer makes us ill, and that apparently has happened to some other viruses. Alec Cole-Hamilton, same question. Do we live with it? What do we do? What's the end?
We certainly live
with
it. We certainly live with it, Brian. There are still strains of the 2019 Spanish flu pandemic at large around the world. And that's just a factor of these viruses. It's very difficult to globally eradicate a viral strain, especially one that is as sticky and as busy as COVID is. But that said, I mean, the only reason that we're seeing surges again in the UK and in other parts of the world is because of Delta. And Delta represents the first aspect of virus or vaccine escape, where the vaccines we have are great at stopping harm, but not great at stopping transmission. They were great at stopping transmission of the original variants, but we just haven't got the tech yet to catch up. That will change. We will have boosters which have the tech behind which is geared up to deal with Delta. So it will make life a lot easier, but it will be an arms race with the variants as they come. And just a final note to say, I absolutely agree that we have a social justice imperative to, as Sarah said, to recognise our international obligations to developing nations and bring everyone to this, because until everyone is safe, nobody is safe.
Audrey, a brief word from you, the exit strategy of the end game.
I mean, I agree with all the points that have been made, and I think Sarah's not the only nerd in the call. I've spent the summer walking my dog and listening to Chatham House podcasts on the development of the COVID vaccine, which were absolutely fascinating. But that global aspect and that global response is really key. The Western world has a big part to play in that, and ultimately that will be that will impact on to what extent we are going to have to live with it. But I think we are for quite some time to come.
Thanks all, Audrey, Alex, Murdo, Sarah, thanks very much indeed. Very, very good advice there. You want to spend your holidays, spend it in the ferry, which is very, very close to the cradle of civilization, which is, of course, Tannadice Park. From me, Brian Taylor, toodaloo.
This podcast was brought to you by The Herald. Take 20% off an annual subscription to The Herald with our exclusive podcast code. Just add Herald Pod 2021 to your basket and get instant, unfiltered access to our website. And you can also get involved with the Brian Taylor podcast as well. Tune in on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube every Thursday afternoon to catch Brian and his panel chat live and ask your questions to the people across the political scene.